Bienvenue tout le monde. Thank you for coming tonight for this interesting conversation, Ciné-club conversation with Nicolas. Some of you may have met him already because we've had a partnership ongoing now for a while with Nicolas, who came to DC a few times for our Ciné-club and was the mind behind the film festival that we had last year, and it shows all the movies that you were able to see at the first French film festival that we held in November last year. Of course, this year it's impossible because of COVID to hold the festival, but it's nice for us to have Nicolas tonight with this special Ciné-club, which is linked with the AFI Film Festival, the EU Film Festival. Of course, we'll talk about the French movies tonight, some of them. Nicolas, as Natasha mentioned, is a translator and a cinema critic who's based in New York City. He's the former US correspondent for the Cahiers du Cinéma, which is the Bible of cinematographic critique in France. He's also a former programmer of the film festival at Locarno in Switzerland and currently contributing editor on Bomb magazine. He's an expert at cinema, definitely. I want to take this opportunity also to thank a few of you who decided to donate some money towards this free event. First of all, Luz Torres, as well as Molly Winans, Matthew Fuchs, and Jordana Wilson. And I take also that opportunity to, I've seen Maya, to salute one of my colleagues from the Georgian Cultural Center there. And I'll leave the floor now to Nicolas. And we first to Natasha. We're going to show you the trailer of the first movie that Nicolas will talk about. And then when we go to the second movie, À l'abordage, we will show you a clip as well. And then Natasha and I will mention two other movies of this EU Film Festival, French movies that you may want to see as well and that we have both seen. Thank you, Natasha.
Pour qu'on parle de ce que tu as fait. Le juge a besoin de savoir pourquoi tu agis de cette manière. Et c'est à moi de donner mon avis.
Non, ça vous regarde pas.
Ça va, mon chéri?
Ouais.
Oh Dieu, mais qu'est-ce que tu lui as fait?
Maman, elle a exagéré, c'est tout, c'est rien.
Un bon bachot, c'est tout ce qu'il te faut. Allez!
Avec ta mère, vous faites ça à tous les mecs qui chavirent. C'est que c'est ma première fois. Hein. Tu te détends, tu résistes jamais au mouvement. Tu te laisses aller.
Fait plaisir à voir tous les deux.
Salut beau mec. Toi et moi, on a des milliers de balades à faire ensemble. On se connaît que depuis ce matin. Pourquoi perdre du temps? On est tous mortels. À cet instant précis, il n'y avait rien au monde que j'aurais pu lui refuser. Je voulais passer tout mon temps avec lui. Et pourtant, quand j'étais avec lui, cela ne me suffisait pas non plus. Alex, on pourrait peut-être emmener Kate faire une promenade?
Ah, j'adorerais.
Vous savez, Alexis, c'est un gentil garçon. On veut l'aider parce que c'est notre fils et qu'on l'aime.
C'est toi la question.
Et moi, quoi?
Mais toi, tu m'ennuies, toi.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Disparais ou j'appelle la police. Disparais!
Et pour toi, ce qui est important, c'est pas ce qu'on fait ensemble. C'est moi que tu veux. Et ça, c'est pas possible, Alex.
J'ai besoin de comprendre ce qui s'est passé.
Voilà, la parole est à Nicolas. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Natasha. And thank you all for being here for this Ciné-club. I recognize some of your faces and names from in-person or virtual events in the past. So it's nice to feel among friends, especially because I'm going to start with a little confession. When Sarah was kind enough to approach me about doing this event, we figured out what the French films at the AFI festival were going to be, and Sarah charged me with picking two that we would discuss. À l'abordage was a no-brainer because I'd seen that film at the Berlin Film Festival and think it's a great film, but I hadn't seen as many of the other films, and so I chose Summer of '85, Été 85, because its director, François Ozon, has a significant body of work. I'm familiar with his work. And I knew that no matter what the film was, there would be something to talk about. And I do think there's something to talk about. And I especially think that it's going to be interesting to talk about these two films in relationship to each other. but I must admit to you that now that I've seen Summer of '85, I think it's quite a bad film. And in fact, I only know a French word off the top of my head to say what I think of it, which is un nanar. Maybe the right English expression would be a turkey. But I hope some of you at least felt like you didn't waste your time watching it, and that we can have a discussion about it and cordially disagree with each other, perhaps. I will tell you a little bit about Ozon's background, because he's an important figure in French cinema at the moment, and has been for some time. And I'll say some things about Summer of '85 from a factual perspective, an objective perspective, and then I might get a little subjective. And I think the most interesting thing, at least from my perspective, is how we can compare this film to À l'abordage, though they're actually two films that have absolutely nothing in common other than the French language and taking place in summer. So François Ozon is actually kind of a unique case in French cinema. He's a relatively young man. He's in his early 50s, and he has the privilege, and as I said, very rare position of being a writer-director who basically has been able to make the films that he wanted for 25 years now. The film that we're talking about, Summer of '85, is his 19th feature film, and he's always written and directed the films that he chose, basically at a rate of one a year, which is just an increasingly unlikely position for what you could call an auteur to be in. Someone who is not making, super commercial comedies, who is not making a sequel to a sequel, who is not accepting to make a package deal that matches the two hottest young actors and some hot intellectual property. It's very unusual. And so Ozon is this guy who has been making films since the late 90s, has the distinction of being an openly gay director whose themes frequently touch on queer issues, and have basically since the beginning of his career, which is, he's really of the first generation of directors in France that could do that in a commercial context. And his films have been commercial. He's had great successes. One that goes back a long way now, at late 90s or early 2000s, was this film Huit Femmes, 8 Women, which was a chamber piece with the 8 leading ladies of France at that time: Catherine Deneuve, Isabelle Huppert, Fanny Ardant, etc. Around the same time, he made a Fassbinder adaptation. He's always fancied himself, I think, a bad boy. And so many of his films have had some element of provocation, some element of scandal. And we'll return to that talking about Summer of '85. And then more recently, right before Summer of '85, he had a huge box office success and a genuine social impact with his previous film, which is called À la gloire de Dieu. The English title is, I don't remember, in God's name or something like that. It's based on the true story of a priest in Lyon who for decades was abusing children. And at the time, and this was basically well known to all in the church, up to and including the Bishop of Lyon, which is an extremely important position in the Roman Catholic Church. And at the time that Ozon made his film, this priest was still in place, the bishop was still in place, and by the time the film had rolled out and been seen by about 1 million French people, both of these men were no longer in place and were facing criminal charges in the case of the priest. So he's someone who has been at the heart of French social dialogue for close to 2 decades, and who kind of, in my opinion, goes back and forth between making what you might call a classical, or if you're less generous, an academic film. The À la gloire de Dieu is certainly a very kind of normative film in the way that it's made. He'll make a film like that, and then he'll make another one that might be a little riskier in a certain sense. And so one could say that Summer of '85 is the slightly riskier. If he really is in this back and forth, Summer of '85 might be the riskier, not so much because it's about a gay relationship, because I think at this point, audiences, in particular Ozon's audiences, are very used to that. I mean, at this point, Call Me By Your Name has been a global mega success that clearly speaks to people who are not identifying as gay or queer or so on. No, I think what I would, if I was to argue that Summer of '85 was a riskier proposition, it would have to do more with his narrative wildness. And I don't think this movie is wild at all, but I do think that both his downfall and his calling card, I'm talking about Ozon, is that he's not afraid of ridicule. The man takes chances from a narrative point of view, and he's willing to, in a sense, have his heart on his sleeve. When I sat here and watched Summer of '85 and I saw the boy Alex/Alexis dance on his recently deceased lover's grave while listening to Rod Stewart's Sailing on his headphones, with the camera kind of swooping around in a very majestic dolly move, I laughed aloud, and may even have said a few words to my empty apartment about how utterly ridiculous what I was beholding was. But I have to give Ozon credit for going there. You can't really restrict Summer of '85 to one thing. You can't say it's just like a by the books coming of age movie. You can't say it's just a romance. He goes, in my opinion, in a way that detracts from the power of his filmmaking. He goes a little bit all over the place, but I have to respect, to some degree, that level of freedom, of trying things out, etc. So let me explain a little bit more about what I mean with this introduction to the film. But before I do that, I'll just give you a few facts about what this film is. Summer of '85 is an adaptation of quite a popular British children's book by Aidan Chambers. The book is called Dance on My Grave. It was published in 1981, and it was one of the first books for young people, children, that had an openly gay relationship that was seen in a positive light. I mean, obviously the events of the story are dramatic, but the characters experience their love as a positive thing. So this is a book that had a certain historical importance in the early '80s. And interestingly, François Ozon read the book at that time. He read it in the summer of '84, actually, when he was 17. And he has said that he always wanted to make a film of that book, that as soon as he read it, when he read it at the age of 17, he was already making Super 8 films as an amateur. He had the impulse or the instinct to make it his first feature film. And then for whatever reason, that didn't happen. But in one of the most interesting statements to me that he made about this film, he said that he noticed once he had made it, so this is his 19th feature film, that the film seemed to be full of references to his earliest work, his early short films, his first couple of features. And in fact, those references were totally unintentional on his part. He realized, came from the fact that he was so marked by the book that his early film work stole from the book left, right, and center. And I don't mean steal in a pejorative way. I do believe that, great artists help themselves in an honorable way, and then make their own thing from that. And it appears that that's what he did. The reason Summer of '84 became Summer of '85 is amusing to me, very anecdotal. But for those of you who've seen it, you might have heard the pop song by The Cure, In Between Days. This was very important to to François Ozon that this song be part of the film. So he got in touch with The Cure's lead singer and songwriter, Robert Smith, who refused to allow Ozon to have the rights to the film, to the song, because the film was titled Summer of '84 and the song came out in the summer of '85. So Ozon, being a flexible individual, I suppose, changed his title to Summer of '85 and was allowed to use the song. And for me, that was at least a high point of the film, to revisit the '80s through that song. And the film is, in general, quite a nostalgic proposition. Ozon chose to shoot the film on Super 16, so on celluloid, which means that he was using a format that existed at that time, which is a warm format. It has some grain. It tends to be the go-to for filmmakers who want to immediately make us associate an image with the past or something bygone. And of course, we have all the cultural references. Sarah mentioned to me that she recognized references to this series, À nous les petites Anglaises, that was about British girls in France. I recognized in Alex's bedroom, because I was a kid living in France and in Luxembourg in the mid '80s, I saw several books that I owned, the same one. So it's very authentic. Now, a little bit more about what Ozon is as a filmmaker, who he is as a filmmaker. And this will slowly move us toward our transition into À l'abordage, which is a film that I'm much fonder of. Ozon is, in my eyes, a filmmaker who is constantly aware of what he is doing to the audience, of where the audience is and what the audience is experiencing. So that, on some level, is totally laudable. It's on some level perhaps the greatest thing that can be accomplished by a filmmaker. If you think in the most classical terms of what someone like Alfred Hitchcock is doing, where Hitchcock at his best, I think, understands what we're expecting, what we're fearing, what we're wanting at every minute. That's, in a sense, in a very strict classical sense, mastery of the tools of filmmaking. And I do think clearly Ozon has that mastery on some level, or he wouldn't have made 19 films over the course of less than 25 years. The question is what you do with that mastery. And in my opinion, Ozon is more of a provocateur, more of a teaser than someone who really uses this mastery to expose us as an audience to deeper, darker, or maybe more uplifting, it doesn't have to be dark, sides of the human experience. I mean, if I return to Hitchcock, something like Vertigo, which any film nerd like myself considers one of the absolutely greatest accomplishments of cinema, Hitchcock knows exactly who you think is what, when, at every moment, but he somehow can open abysses within that where he's handling you and you're plunging into existential, erotic infinity. I'm being a little bit lofty and maybe vague in my way of talking about this, but I am talking about one of the greatest films of all time, so it's hard to be specific in a sense. Ozon, I feel, and especially with this film, is just always in a teasing relationship with you. What am I talking about? Within the first 3 minutes, we have a character who's talking to you in voiceover, look at you, i.e. the camera, straight in the eye and say, if you're not interested in a story about death, then this film isn't for you. Whoa, okay. We have a camera going down a red hallway following two handsome young men. They close the door and you're looking through the keyhole. I'm not going to tell you what happened that night, but it was the most beautiful night of my life. We have a structure that's constantly moving back and forth in time, teasing you with what exactly happened. Why is this boy in trouble? Why did the other one die? And Ozon knows, of course, because he's a good filmmaker in a technical sense, exactly at what point you're going to think Alex killed David, David killed himself. And then finally, you find out the reason Alex is in trouble is that he is in trouble for allegedly desecrating graves, which incidentally at that time in France in the 80s, and unfortunately to this day, was no laughing matter because there's a nasty habit in France of desecrating Jewish cemeteries. But Ozon is playing with us. I feel he's playing with us and not actually telling us something of profound significance about the human experience. And that's where this double-edged comment I've made about him, which is that I appreciate his freedom and his wildness, but also see it as his downfall. That's where that comes in. He tells you this is going to be a movie about a kid that's obsessed with death. I hope you'll disagree with me if you feel this way when we get to exchange views later in the conversation, but this is not a movie about death. I mean, it's a movie in which a kid a few times says, I'm obsessed with death. And, you know, I have pictures of Egyptian sarcophagi on my wall, but it's not about that. Nor is it a movie really about coming to terms with a first same-sex attraction, nor is it really a movie about overbearing mothers or proletarian fathers. I feel that it's a movie of constant superficial, surface level gestures and rather masterful play with the audience. But I think that Ozon falls down and actually loses the game with us once we know what the deal is. About halfway through the film, we realize, okay, Alex is in trouble not because they think he's a murderer, but because he went and danced on this grave. And then the film just, in my opinion, especially once David dies, just goes in all these different directions that, again, I praise Ozon for not being afraid of the ridiculous, but that are ridiculous. It's supposed to be a movie about death, but when this young man goes to see his dead lover's dead body, so presumably it's the first time this boy sees a dead body. It's the only time we see a dead body in a movie that is in part allegedly about death. The scene is grotesque. I'm sorry, it's grotesque. I find this an objective fact that the boy runs off losing his wig with his, you know, it's grotesque. And anything is possible in cinema to have depth, dignity, and import. That scene could exist. I'm not saying that I refuse the possibility of a scene in which a boy who has gotten dressed up as a girl to be allowed to see his dead boyfriend's body gets caught and runs away, losing his wig and half of his dress. That's possible. That can work. But the way that Ozon did it, the way I experience it, is as unwanted comedy. It's the same way I feel about the dancing on the grave. It's the same way I feel about much of what is supposed to be, I think, because one thing that I'm pretty sure, having seen many François Ozon movies, is that he doesn't have a sense of humor. It's supposed to be funny. It's not supposed to be funny. So that's the hatchet job that I've done about summer of '85. And I now want to shift to talk about À l'abordage, the other film. And so I guess we'll take a quick look just at a clip from that film, just to refresh our memories, or if some of you haven't seen it, to give you at least a taste of this film, if you wouldn't mind, Natasha.
We will in a minute. I just want to confirm a couple of things, that because Nicolas knows I have also seen an awful lot of Ozon movie, including actually his short movies that I didn't know until Nicolas just told us that they were obviously inspired in a way by the book Dance on the Grave. Myself, I didn't realize that he made the movie from this book. I thought that he had gotten his inspiration from another book, a Boris Vian book, you know, being the French person that I am, j'irai cracher sur vos tombes, and that he changed it to I will dance on your grave instead of I will spit on your grave, which is the title of the book by Boris Vian. But definitely I agree with Nicolas that Ozon has this uncanny genius of being able to manipulate the public and to really wrap you, the viewer, around his finger, because all this voyeuristic approach, I'm not going to tell you what's behind the door, etc. He has used it already in another movie that I saw called In the House. That was also an Ozon movie, and so and of course the gay queer themes are prevalent in many of his movies, including in the one which I saw called France, which when I went to see it, I was in Paris and I was with a friend of mine from the Fondation Alliance Française. And I was watching it and I was realizing it was a movie I had written about for my thesis on war and cinema, which is a Lubitsch movie called Broken Lullaby. And Ozon managed to remake that movie and then add another one, completely different movie, all the way to the end, who makes it much longer, but very interesting. So he does have that uncanny genius. And that moment that Nicolas just mentioned about the morgue, for those of you who may have seen this other movie, which contains both more comedy than tragedy, and that is really comic, not at all like the scene in the other movie. It's called Death at a Funeral with Peter Dinklage. If you have seen it, there is a scene that is a bit of a reminder, and I was wondering whether Ozon had taken his inspiration from that movie, and that's a question I certainly will ask him if I ever see or meet him. But for now, Natasha, yes, please, thank you for showing us the little clip about À l'abordage.
Entrez. Qu'est-ce que je peux faire pour toi?
C'est à propos de ma grand-mère.
Qu'est-ce qu'elle a ta grand-mère? Elle avait une carte de réduction?
Non, elle vit pas ici, ma grand-mère. Elle vit au bled. Enfin, elle vivait.
Voir à couche?
Bah oui, justement, en fait, ma grand-mère, elle va pas bien du tout, là. En fait, elle est morte.
Elle va pas bien ou elle est morte?
Elle est morte.
Quand ça?
Tard dans la nuit ou tôt ce matin, je sais pas trop. Le décalage horaire.
Je suppose que tu aurais quelques jours de congé pour aller voir ta famille et tout, c'est ça?
Ouais, ce serait bien, ça.
Tu veux quoi, 5 jours?
Une semaine, c'est peut-être mieux.
Ah, une semaine?
Ouais.
Bah vas-y, prends une semaine.
Merci, chef.
Par contre, shérif, le jour où ta grand-mère sera vraiment morte, reviens pas me voir, c'est d'accord? Et quand tu auras tes partiels à la fac et que tu voudras des horaires aménagés, je te conseille de me le demander très gentiment.
So that was a scene from À l'abordage, which apparently has the extremely unpleasant English title, All Hands on Deck. So I'm just going to continue referring to it as À l'abordage. À l'abordage means, for me, it evokes like pirate images, like let's storm this ship, let's board this ship. And I'm sure that since this film is rather up to date on French slang and the way that men and women talk to each other and that men talk to each other about women and vice versa, I'm sure that it also must mean approaching a woman, hitting on a woman. And so I think it's a great title that is not reflected in All Hands on Deck. So, À l'abordage, written and directed by Guillaume Brac, a film close to my heart, and I will try to explain why, and then I'll compare a little bit with Summer of '85, which may seem like a vain exercise because they're so different, but I think that there might be some values that we can draw from it that are of interest. I keep having this phrase return to me when I think about this À l'abordage and this director Guillaume Brac, whose work I know well, which is in the tradition. It's a phrase that comes from jazz about like working in the tradition, like something that's been passed down and being within the tradition, but maybe moving it forward as well or shifting it. And that's really how I think about Guillaume Brac, who's a relatively young director in his mid-40s. he has been making films for about 10 years. This is his fourth feature, and he had a couple of medium-length shorts that had a lot of success at the beginning of his career on the festival circuit. And the reason I talk about this in the tradition idea is that I come from a tradition. I was bred on French auteurism. I wrote for a very long time for Cahiers du Cinéma. And I recognize that Guillaume Brac is working in the idiom that has existed throughout the history of French cinema, and that one could say starts or maybe has its first truly glorious moment with Jean Renoir, and then you can continue down the ages. A very obvious predecessor to Guillaume Brac, who he mentions often and who probably won't be known to most of you because he's not that famous in the States, is a guy called Jacques Rosier, who actually is like I can't say he's the forgotten member of the French New Wave, of the directors who kind of changed cinema in the late 50s, early 60s, Godard, Truffaut, etc. One can't say he's forgotten because people who really care about film know about him, but he never achieved the level of these other directors that I just mentioned, Godard, Truffaut, Chabrol, etc. But he had a way, Rosier, he's actually still alive. He's 92 and he hasn't made a film in a long time, but he and Godard are the last men standing of that generation. And I can say last man because unfortunately the last woman, Agnès Varda, left us not that long ago. Rosier had something, first of all, he loved summer movies. He made several movies that were very much in the mold of à l'abordage, people going off on vacation, stumbling into who they stumble into, something very, not improvised, but something about the sparks and rawness of life, just something very, I can't quite say it. But Rosier trusts time and people. I'll come back to that maybe when we talk about Ozon. And Brac is a descendant of that. It's also very obvious, particularly in à l'abordage, that he's a descendant of Éric Rohmer, who I think many of you probably know, and who made many films about young, good-looking people on summer holiday, trying to find someone to be with, failing, succeeding, being lonely, not being lonely, and just not really focusing too much on events, letting people and their combinations and the words that they exchange and the settings that they're in be enough. And so that's really what my thing is about a comparison between À l'abordage and Summer of '85, is that I feel that Guillaume Brac, who in every respect is much less a technically accomplished director than François Ozon, but Guillaume Brac allows the present and the viewer to be enough. He's not thinking about what does the viewer think now. He's not thinking about tricking us. And again, tricking isn't a bad thing. There's amazing directors that trick you. I mean, we could even talk about The Sixth Sense, Shyamalan, things like that. It's, there's no problem with that. But I always ask for some deeper import or meaning to that. And otherwise, I come from the tradition of cinema that is about capturing life, if one can claim to do such a preposterous thing. And I feel that Guillaume Brac is doing that in this film. He's just taking us along with some people and seeing what happens. He's not playing games with us. He's just seeing what happens. And the reason I call it, or I keep thinking about this thing of in the tradition, which may or may not be really an accurate interpretation of what that means in a jazz idiom, but the way I interpret it is that Brac is clearly the person taking this easily stereotyped, easily mocked thing of French cinema young, handsome people falling in love on summer vacation, basically, and bringing it to the present day. And one of the ways he's doing it is that his lead characters, two of them, Félix and Shérif, are young Black guys. And a thing that I love about this movie is that it's about many things, but it's not about race. That's not an issue. It's not an issue movie. It's also not a hypocritical movie. It doesn't deny how Félix and Shérif might appear to certain people in certain settings. Sometimes it's a funny joke. Like, for instance, when the white guy turns to Félix and says, "Do you have some weed?" It's that stereotype. He's aware of that, Brac. He's recognizing it, but he's not making an issue film. And this, if I have to go further at this particular moment in time about why this film touches me, despite how light it feels, despite how it might feel nearly ephemeral, it's that it makes me feel good. And it doesn't only make me feel good because I like to think that it's possible for two guys like Félix and Shérif to go on an impromptu holiday in La Drôme and not have it turn into a nightmare. It also makes me feel good because it's a film about people who don't belong together, coming together and making it work. Edouard, the prissy, uptight white boy, and Félix and Shérif, they make a beautiful trio. They tap into some wonderful values of loyalty. And that, I find that's something throughout the film. It's a film that touches on decency, really. Perhaps with the exception of the young girl, Alma, who, let's say I wouldn't like to meet a real life version of her. Everybody else in this movie is neither dumb nor an asshole. Forgive my English. The scene that Natasha showed us is a perfect example of that. Shérif goes to ask his boss for time off. He tells him a lie. My grandmother's dead. His boss gives him the time off and lets him and us know, I'm not a fool. There's something very beautiful and simple about that. And I'd like to think that it's possible that that can be how life is as well. So many films would have a comedic scene in which the boss is much more of an asshole, forgive my English, and much more of an idiot. He would be mean just to be mean, and he wouldn't understand that he's being conned. So this is something I really appreciate about À l'abordage. The other thing is that in my eyes, it's a comedy that really works. It's a comedy that is using all the things that are so classically successful in comedy. It's dealing with deception and disappointment, the gap between reality and lies, or between reality and imagination. Again, people who don't belong together, which I think is really beautifully executed in this film. Selfishness and selflessness. It's very successful in that sense. And I want to just go a little bit further before we all talk together, talking about Guillaume Brac and continuing this idea that I'm digging at about being in the tradition, and this thing that he's doing of bringing new faces into the tradition. I think actually that's the best way to talk about it, is that I think we've all seen decades of French films with a certain kind of young, good-looking French person sitting in cafes or going to the beach and feeling sorry for themselves and then eventually not feeling sorry for themselves. Some of these films are my favorite films, but we've all seen many of them. And that really is what I'm trying to get at with À l'abordage, is that Guillaume Brac comes from where I come from as a viewer. Clearly, he has seen those films and he has loved them and he has learned from them, but he is taking them into contemporary France. And I hope that it will be difficult for me to do this in a nuanced way. I hope that you understand that I'm not talking about this film in a way to promote identity politics, regardless of what my positions or anyone's positions are regarding that question. It's really about what I think is a reality, and taking an art form, so cinema, but specifically cinema as an art of reality, cinema staying up to date with reality, cinema not staying 10 years behind, 20 years behind, 30 years behind, two people that we've seen a million times sitting in a cafe crying about love. I think he's taking it forward, and he's taking it forward in a gentle, enjoyable, humble way. And I think that he came to this through documentary, interestingly enough. He started as a fiction filmmaker, and the situation for the kind of films that he makes, i.e. small scale, low budget, with low prospects for commercial returns, the situation of that kind of film being what it is, he had trouble making the projects that he wanted to make, despite the fact that he was a festival success, despite the fact that he had good reviews. So at a certain point, he did two things. One was he entered a partnership with the French National Conservatory for Acting, and he started making films with their student body, which automatically brought new faces, young bodies, different kinds of faces in. And at the same time, he started making a documentary called L'Île au Trésor, Treasure Island, at a huge recreational swimming park outside Paris. And so naturally, if you're making a documentary in a recreational park in the suburbs of Paris in 2015, you're going to have a varied population. You're going to have faces that we're actually still not that used to seeing in a certain kind of French film, especially not that used to seeing them when it's not about them being who they are, being an issue. And so L'Île au Trésor was a big success on its scale, critically, with viewers, on a very modest scale on the box office. And I think that that reinvigorated Brac to keep moving toward a contemporary France while staying in the tradition. And I think everything I've said has made clear now the comparison with Summer of '85. I don't really think I need to underline it more than that. I think that for me, it's that you have on the one hand in Brac, a filmmaker trusting both the viewer and the small things, a character sitting on top of a hill, and you see that there's a breeze because the leaves move, and the character says how nice that breeze is. Just these small, small things. And then you have a director who is much more caught up in being sure that he knows what you think and feel, and then laying on, just in my opinion, sloppily and quickly, meaning, you know, like the last line, which apparently comes from the novel, saying the important thing is to escape the life that you're going to lead, or some, in my opinion, hokum like that. So that's my bit about these two films. I see that there's messages in the chat, so maybe I'll let Sarah MC, and I hope to, be hearing from you as we talk.
We have somebody, Nicolas, who seems to be agreeing upon everything you say about À l'abordage, and also about what you said of Summer '85, Monette Mélenchon, and I think I'm hoping I pronounce it well. That she saw both films as coming of age, although very different for sure, and she preferred the second film, that your insights were wonderful and she greatly appreciated. Then she went on to say that Guillaume Brac is definitely honest and doesn't insult us, that there's a wonderful ending, like you mentioned yourself. You said that it made you feel good, and she said she felt happy, which is uncommon these days. And repeated that there's a lot of humanity in the film, and that you articulated so well. And the difference with the Summer '85, and that she thought that the way Ozon was doing the movie is, and taking the viewer, us, for what he's taking them, is like degrading the intellect of the audience, and obviously and she added that also if she was comparing both movies and both director, I guess the way it would like one who is appreciative of the audience versus insulting the audience, which is what Ozon is doing according to her. If that's
I should tell everyone that Monette is neither my relative or my employee. This is totally on the level, but thank you, Monette. Clearly we agree about these two films, so I appreciate your comment.
I have a little comment which was sparked by you, Nicolas. First of all, thank you so much for this really brilliant insights. It just adds so much to just, having watched the movies. And I love what you said about François Ozon having, manipulated the audience, teasing us, and even sort of, what did you say, playing with us, right? I remember having watched the movie and thinking, death, that was so deep, right? And then I was like, wait a second, what was so deep about that? And that's true. And it always gets me. I always take French movies very seriously. And then finally I realized that it was either a satire or there was some irony or a grain of salt, right? At least you had to take the movie with a grain of salt. So is it something you would say is common for French movie filmmakers?
The truth is, I don't know that Ozon is asking us to take reality with a grain of salt. That for me is the problem with him. I think that he's very earnest. I think that this is the film that we saw, Summer of '85. I think it's a very, in his eyes, I think he would tell you that it's a very personal film, very deeply felt, that he's been thinking about for basically his whole mature life on some level. So that's exactly the problem. That's the problem with the scene in the morgue and so on, is that I don't taste the salt, even though it's by the sea, the movie. I don't find the grain of salt. Then in general, I would say, I think that French filmmakers are pretty in earnest, actually, because I think, as we all would recognize, there is still a very lofty sense of cinema, literature, art in general, the gravitas of making art in French culture. And so I think that they take things very, very seriously. And I would even like kind of tip in the other direction and say that French comedy is not particularly exportable or notable, because that's not the specialty. The specialty, in my opinion, is cinema that goes for it. Now, if what you mean by grain of salt is there an intellectual distance? Yes, there's an intellectual distance. Like in an Eric Rohmer film, there are some exceptions where people break down and cry, notably a film that's certainly in the lineage of À l'Abordage, The Green Ray, Summer, where there's a lead female protagonist who really is desperate about her loneliness and she breaks down. But in general, people keep a distance from their emotion because they're intellectualizing it. They can discuss it. And then I think that that's something relatively common in French cinema. Or if you look at someone like Arnaud Desplechin, there's people who are dealing with really extreme situations, actually, like literally madness, like in a film like Kings and Queen. People are going nuts, and suicide is a theme. But again, there's that intellectual distance of being able to think about it, not just to feel it.
I enjoyed, Nicolas, when you mentioned the fact that the title of Summer 85 was changed because of Robert Smith, for whom I had an absolute devotion when I was in the 80s, so much so that I was actually looking for like him in terms of hairstyle. Can you imagine? So the soundtrack of the movie Summer '85 was absolutely perfect. I thought it was so reflecting of the '80s as I knew them myself in France. the wink, le clin d'œil to the movie À nous les petites Anglaises, because she looked exactly like, but that was more like the 70s, okay, late 70s movie that gave a specific image to the young British girls that either would come over to France as an au pair, or that the French boys would meet if they went on a sort of a linguistic exchange trip in the summer in the south of England. So that was, I thought that was, for me, that was actually amusing. That was kind of funny, but yes, I can understand that the rest of the movie is not funny. I liked, in L'Abordage, I definitely like when you mentioned Renoir, it reminded me of scenes within Le Crime de Monsieur Lange, where everybody is in the courtyard and everybody lives together, and all of that building and everyone together, a little bit like the camping would be the equivalent of that building in that Renoir movie. But do you know more about the actors in À l'Abordage? Are they all out of the conservatory you mentioned or not?
What I can tell you, obviously, is that none of them are famous. I do remember at the time I had noted that the woman who plays the mother, who Sherif winds up having a fling with, she's a first-time actress. The baby, I can tell you this much, the baby is the director's daughter. That's his own child. But I actually, I don't know. I forgot to look it up, so I can't answer you. I'm seeing if I can look it up right now, since that's an advantage of our virtual experience.
Otherwise, anybody else has a question for Nicolas?
I saw À l'Abordage, and I enjoyed it very much, and I enjoyed your comments about both of the movies. For some reason, which I can't quite articulate, À l'Abordage reminds me a little bit of, it's a little bit of a buddy movie, but it's also a little bit of the Odyssey, you know, where there's like a journey with adventures, and there's women, and some of the women are, you know, witches and sorcerate you, and others, you know, like there's definitely the siren at the end, and and I also thought all of the actors were wonderful. You know, they had just the right, there was no false notes or anything in their, you know, roles that they played.
That's a really good point about the Odyssey. I mean, he's not Ozon, so he plays it very discreetly, but I think it makes sense. And if you think also of when they go canyoning and they have to jump into the mouth of, you know, a river or whatever like that, and the end is absolutely, he says as much. Felix says it's like a siren. I did look up while we were talking that none of the actors have other credits, so they're first timers. I don't know who is at the Conservatoire or not. That's in the interviews I read with Brac, he didn't get into that part actually, so I don't know. But I agree that they're really great, all of them.
Yeah, very natural. I mean, you know, as if they were just living it, you know, not acting it, but just living it. So that was, whilst in the summer of '85, I personally thought that those two main characters, at times, they were a little bit overdoing it in terms of acting. So, yeah.
Well, it's it's two completely different profiles. I don't know what the future holds for we'll talk about the young men, since you're talking about the young men who were in À l'Abordage, but they're on a different trajectory than the guys in summer of '85, who are both clearly up and coming major stars. I mean, they're both in their early 20s, but they both have numerous credits. The guy who plays David is in a new film adaptation of Lost Illusions, where he's playing Lucien Rubempré vis-a-vis Gérard Depardieu and Xavier Dolan. So, you know, these are probably box office draws of the future. So it's a whole different, well, they're already perhaps more manufactured, if I'm going to be like harsh and maybe a little bit cynical about it. But I agree. But, you know, it's also what they're given to play. I mean, maybe these guys would be great if they were in a film by Guillaume Brac, but in the context of what they're doing, that's the aesthetic.
Then Nicolas, would you want to say the le mot de la fin about cinema?
Whoa, the last word on cinema? The last word on cinema is I hope that, you know, next year we'll all be in a movie theater together. That's the last word on cinema. Because it was great to watch À l'Abordage again through the AFI platform. It really was, but I saw it initially in a movie theater. And again, because Brac is a kind of filmmaker that's not underlining every single thing for you. You know, he's not going to do a close-up on someone's face or on a detail to get the laugh or to get the tear. He's more of a wide shot or medium shot director. Some of the comedy was diluted for me. I mean, when I saw it in a movie theater, it was a memorable experience. Aside from the movie, the experience for me of being in the movie theater and just enjoying that movie so much. So it's great that we're able to keep seeing movies while we have to stay safe. And I'm extremely grateful that all of you joined us today to talk about these movies. But I really hope that in the not too distant future, we'll be able to see the movies the way they're supposed to be seen and shake hands at the end of the evening.
That is absolutely true, Nicolas, because I have seen many now, a lot of the EU film that are during the festival, because I absolutely love this festival. It's the one that the Alliance Française has been supporting for 4 years now. We're sponsors of this festival. So I really, really encourage you to watch not only the French movies, of course, because we are, after all, the Alliance Française, but all of the other ones. And some of them are absolutely overwhelming in terms of cinematography. So watching them on my small laptop doesn't give them justice, I know. So I hope, like Nicolas, that next year in 2021, we will be able again to watch a movie on the big screen. Thank you very much for all of you to have been here tonight. I hope to see you again, not yet at the Alliance, unfortunately, because we will still be online for much of 2021, I'm afraid. But we will continue having all of these online events, and we'll try to organize more Ciné-club with Nicolas as well. Take care, and
thank you all.
Thank you, Nicolas.
And happy holidays to all of you.